Okay, it looks like it's about time to get started. So welcome everybody. We're so happy to have you again today out there. So today we have a very special speaker, Dr. Bryan Sykes. So we're so happy to have him. And also to have a moderator here today, Dr. Karen Martin, who will be introducing Dr. Sykes. So I'll just tell you that Dr. Martin is an assistant professor in the Evans School here at UW, and she has a history of collaboration with Dr. Sykes, so we're happy to have them both. So just a reminder before we start, so please put your questions in the Q&A as you think of them, and together we will go through them at the end. So please, don't use chat and go ahead and use the Q&A, and just remember that I can unmute you. So if you want to just say you have a question, that's fine too. And you can talk at the end directly to Dr. Sykes, and that would be great to have that interaction. One other reminder is that we do have the opportunity to talk more with Dr. Sykes afterwards. So all the students are invited into that discussion meeting. It's a separate Zoom link, and we'll put that in the chat at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and let Dr. Martin introduce Dr. Sykes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think everybody can hear me, yes? Yes, okay, great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be lucky enough to introduce Dr. Bryan Sykes because of his awesomeness. I'm going to start with some of the formal aspects of his work and then a few of my own comments. But I will start by saying, so Dr. Bryan Sykes is an associate, not too distant in the past was he tenured, a professor in the Department of Criminology, Law and Society, and by courtesy, Sociology and Public Health. He's also a faculty affiliate in the Center for Demographic and Social Analysis and the Center for Biotechnology and Global Health Policy at the University of California, Irvine. He is an associate editor for Science Advances, which is the open access version of the prestige journal Science. He's an academic editor for the Public Library of Science. You've probably seen that named PLOS One, PLOS1, and he's also co-editor-in-chief of Sociological Perspectives. His research focuses on demography and criminology, broadly defined, with particular interest in fertility, mortality, population health, mass imprisonment, social inequality, and research methodology. Dr. Sykes' research focuses on demography and criminology, and he applies and develops demographic, statistical, and mixed methodologies to understand changing patterns of inequality, both nationally and abroad. His research has appeared in general and multidisciplinary science, social science, and medical journals. If you look at Dr. Sykes' CV, he has so many publications that he literally has to organize them by topic. These topics include research methodology, institutional and structural inequality, as well as population health and team science. The same is true of his service section. There's multiple sections of that. I nearly sprained my fingers scrolling through all 28 pages. But his CV is so long because Dr. Sykes has the type of intellect that makes him a truly exciting scholar to follow. He is productively unconstrained by discipline and methodology, and instead sees each frontier as an opportunity to innovate and collaborate. His creative approach has led to significant contributions in theory, policy, and methodology, which is very impressive. In grad school, I was told the risk of being a generalist, which is what I fancied myself to be, was being a jack of all trades and a master of none. Somehow, Dr. Sykes has managed to become a master of many trades, several of which are on display in the paper he's about to share with us. So I'm excited to hear his presentation, and I ask you to join me in extending a warm Zoom welcome to Dr. Bryan Sykes. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Karen. I hope I can live up to everything that you've said. So thank you. It's truly a pleasure to be here. And I look forward to our conversation following the paper. I want to start by saying that this paper um, was embargoed, and so we couldn't really present it prior to its publication. And then COVID happened, and so it sort of got lost in the institutional shuffle of everyone transitioning to work from home and all of the other sort of chaotic and overly timely changes that took place last year around this time. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging my collaborator, Amy Bailey, who I believe some of you may know, who's an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And so this project grew out of a puzzle that Amy and I were trying to solve. And in particular, we know that on the one hand, the military was historically known as a conduit to upward mobility for African Americans, and particularly for disadvantaged men. And that's important because the military, as a life course turning point, may protect disadvantaged men against criminal justice contact, delinquency, and unemployment. And yet, on the other hand, we also wondered why there were so many disadvantaged African American men at risk of what William Julius Wilson termed social dislocations: unemployment, crime and incarceration, and high school dropout, particularly during the labor market restructuring of the 1970s and 80s. And to get a sense of just how profound these structural changes were, I want to begin by showing you trends in employment status for men aged 20 to 34 by race, education, and sector. And so between 1971 and 2018. And in this figure, the solid line is for non-Hispanic whites with less than a high school education. The dashed line is for non-Hispanic Blacks with less than a high school education. And then if you added little circles on both of those designations, they would represent non-Hispanic white and Black men respectively who had graduated from high school. So at the start of the 1970s, non-Hispanic white and Black men who had graduated from high school had similar shares of representation within the armed forces, vacillating between 4.5% to almost 7%. But for non-Hispanic white and Black men who had dropped out of high school, the share initially was much larger among whites than among Blacks. But over time, what we began to see is that the overall representation within the armed forces was disproportionately being driven by non-Hispanic Black men who had graduated from high school. And non-Hispanic Black men who had dropped out of high school saw their representation within the armed forces almost diminished by the mid-1990s. Now, in terms of the civilian labor market, we see that non-Hispanic whites who have graduated from high school tend to have higher employment rates than any of the other three demographic groups. But there was much more convergence in the early 1970s. But again, as we see through the 70s and 80s, there was significant divergence that took place, whereby Black men who had a high school diploma and white men who had dropped out tended to have similar civilian labor market employment rates, whereas Black men who had dropped out of high school saw their share employed in the civilian labor market decline significantly. Trends in unemployment underscore just how profound that drop was, so that again, Black men who had dropped out of high school have the highest rates of unemployment over time. And again, there was greater convergence or equality between these race and education groups in the early 1970s than there is today. And much of the divergence began to occur in the 1970s and 80s, and then solidifying by the 1990s. If we were to think about permanent removal from the labor force, that is people who are not actively seeking work, the trends are even more bleak, with non-Hispanic Black men who have dropped out of high school having a significant share of their labor force participation, or the lack of seeking work on any given day is much lower than any other race education group. Now, at the same time, the total number of adults incarcerated or on active duty were undergoing significant changes as well. So we know that mass incarceration began a steep increase in the 1970s and continued unabated through the first decade of the 21st century. And at the same time, the number of active duty military personnel began to decline in the early 1970s, going from roughly 480,000 down to a little over 250,000 military personnel. And a result of this is that the share of the US population that were veterans or that experienced incarceration also began to shift. So this solid line is the rate of veterans in the US population between 1972 and 2012 per 100,000. And the dashed line is the incarceration rate per 100,000 in the US as well. And they're on two different scales to show just how profound this shift was for the drawdown of military acquisitions. So in thinking about this puzzle, we began to wonder whether or not there were compositional dislocations, if you will, in these negative social outcomes and social dislocations that Wilson pointed out were beginning to emerge in the 1970s and 80s. And so this formally led us to our research question or questions, which are: how does the military's role as a labor market institution matter for understanding contemporary patterns of mass incarceration? And are there differences in the educational enlistment patterns of white and Black men across generations associated with different levels of incarceration over time? And these questions are important for several reasons. The first is that the armed forces transitioned from a staffing policy based on selective service draft to an all-volunteer force in 1973. So Black men are overrepresented in uniform, and the military became a key labor market option for young men of color, whereby 1 in 4 employed Black men and 1 in 6 employed Latinos were employed in the military. It's also important because of the military drawdown, so that the armed forces increased enlistment criteria in anticipation of military downsizing, virtually eliminating opportunities for enlistment among young men who lacked either a high school diploma or GED and a standardized test score in the middle range. The total number of active duty enlisted personnel also declined by roughly 700,000 during the same period. Additionally, increasing enlistment criteria was known to block men of color from primary labor market opportunities, potentially shifting them to the criminogenic secondary labor market for employment. And research also shows that whites and those with a high school education are disproportionately more likely to receive a military waiver for a felony record than African Americans and those without a high school diploma. So past research demonstrates that Black men are particularly harmed by the loss of jobs due to deindustrialization, which resulted in these social dislocations. Historically, the military service was viewed as an alternative to a trial or to prison during World War II, creating a path, if you will, for men with criminal dispositions and criminal delinquency, putting them on a path to potential turning points. And so the military, as a life course turning point, may protect these disadvantaged men against criminal justice involvement and delinquency. Now, Angrist shows that changes in the minimum enlistment criteria had an adverse effect on the service opportunities of minority applicants. And Pettit and Western also show that incarceration becomes a normative experience for disadvantaged Black men. So our theoretical framework draws on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and in particular, his ideas around hyperbolic doubt, or a questioning of state institutions and their independent functions that appear distinct, and yet their joint effects obscure patterns of social inequality. And in thinking about hyperbolic doubt, we propose that the shifting composition or the shifting compositions of the penal system and the military represent a form of castling. And castling in chess is a special defensive move in which the king and rook shift simultaneously in opposite directions, closely trading places in their relative positions on the board. So this video demonstrates what castling is. And as the only move in chess where a player can shift two pieces at the same time, castling enables the king to lessen the risk of checkmate by moving to a safer location, while the rook plays a more active role throughout the game. So we argue that institutional castling, the shifting prominence of state institutions in the lives of particular demographic groups following a change in social policy or judicial decisions, allow more prominent, protective, and integrative institutions to exchange their risk of exposure with less active and more punitive agencies across generations. Now, institutional castling may be the result of either disparate treatment, intentionality, disparate impact, unintentional consequences, or unconscious bias following the enactment of a particular policy or judicial decision. So whereas castling, the chess move, may require intentionality, institutional castling as a concept does not rely exclusively on intentionality. And in particular, changes to the educational enlistment criteria castled the roles of the military and criminal justice system in the lives of young disadvantaged Black men during a period of increasing deindustrialization. So in order to understand the full scope of institutional castling in American history, the first instance of institutional castling between the military and carceral systems took place during an era of slavery. So that in Black Reconstruction in America, Du Bois identifies how the shifting Northern interpretations of two key policies led to the institutional castling of the military and criminal justice system for slaves and freed men, given that fugitives from slavery and free Negroes were precluded from joining the Union Army. So the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 decreed that people who escaped slavery had to be returned to their masters. And the Dred Scott v. Sanford decision of 1857 ruled that the US Constitution did not apply to Blacks, whether enslaved or free. And yet, despite these laws and judicial decisions, Union Army generals routinely employed fugitive and freed slaves as soldiers, spies, servants, military laborers, and laborers on plantations. And although initially supportive of excluding fugitives and enslaved men from the Union Army, President Lincoln, quote, faced the truth front forward. The Negro was to be allowed to fight, or the draft itself would not bring enough white men into the army to keep up the war. And thus, the initial disparate treatment of slaves and free men under the Fugitive Slave Act and the Dred Scott decision were set aside to ensure that the Union Army had sufficient soldiers and resources throughout the war, providing the first instance of institutional castling where, quote, slaves became organized and formed a great labor force for the Army. So the military policy to integrate fugitive and freed slaves into the Union Army also produced a set of disparate impacts. So formerly enslaved Blacks and their families were segregated from white Union service members. So Du Bois writes that, quote, there were new and strange problems of the social contract. The white soldiers, for the most part, were opposed to serving Negroes in any manner and were even unwilling to guard the camps where they were segregated or protect them against violence, end quote. So that the disparate impact of integrating freed slaves into the military, but holding them at arm's length, facilitated a de facto system of racial segregation that would engender the disbandment of Blacks and freed slaves from specific units of the armed forces after the Civil War ended, recastling the institutions of the military and penal system during Reconstruction in Southern states, where Black codes emerged to control the labor and criminalize the behavior of former slaves and African Americans. So we argue that the mid to late 20th century was another turning point in the American life cycle of institutional castling between the military and penal spheres for young, undereducated Black men. So on February 27th, 1877, Congress passed an act whereby no minor under the age of 16 years, no insane or intoxicated person, no deserter from the service, and no person who has been convicted of a felony shall be enlisted or mustered into military service. Now, when in 1968, Congress created 10 USC 503A, stating that no person who is insane, intoxicated, or a deserter from the armed force or who has been convicted of a felony may be enlisted in any armed force. However, the Secretary of Defense concerned may authorize exceptions in meritorious cases for the enlistment of deserters and persons convicted of felonies. And this amendment carves out exceptions in the US Code, allowing for the possibility of felony and conduct waivers during the enlistment process. So that between 1948 and 1968, the percentage of non-African Americans with a felony record had nearly doubled from 1% to 2%. And among African Americans, the percentage grew from 5% to 8% over the same period, with men bearing the brunt of this institutional growth. Yet contemporary research by Lundquist, Pager, and Strader shows that the military personnel who were granted these felony waivers under this amendment do not reflect the racial and educational distribution of the people with felony records. And at the same time Congress was amending this 1877 act, they were also passing crime control legislation. So the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 established the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, also known as LEAA, now known as the Office of Justice Programs, which then allocated $100 million in block grants to states, with half of the money going to local law enforcement. The LEAA also provided resources to develop alternative sanctions for the punishment of young offenders and to deal with rioting and organized crime. The Safe Streets Act also expanded the use of surveillance at the local level and provided for closer training between local law enforcement and the FBI. Thus, the coterminous creation of 10 USC 504A aimed at excluding people with felony records from the military unless waived, and the enactment of crime control legislation and its authorized funding apparatus were not accidental. These decisions represent intentional actions to reconstitute the functioning of particular American institutions. So in order to assess whether or not the military and penal spheres were recastling during the mid to late 20th century, we draw on a wealth of data. So we construct veteran, enlistment, and incarceration rates by race, gender, age, and education from the survey of inmates in local jails, the survey of inmates in state and federal correctional facilities, and we also use the current population survey to identify the percentage of people in the military, employed in the military. And we also use the Bureau of Justice Statistics data to obtain inmate counts by facility type. And following methods that have been outlined in other studies, which if you have questions, we can talk about that, we construct these race, age, gender, and education specific incarceration and veteran rates over time. So we employ a standard demographic technique to understand educational inequality in military enlistment and incarceration. We use Kitagawa's 1955 standardization and decomposition method to examine how the changing size of the veteran population and the shifting educational requirements for enlistment converge to explain differences in the non-veteran incarceration rate for particular groups. So, for example, CPS population count C and the incarceration rate M for veterans V and non-veterans NV during year T can be decomposed into two parts: the contribution of compositional differences in the veteran population, the first term, and the contribution of differences in the incarceration rate, the second term, as displayed in equation 1. So the first term before the plus sign measures the relative difference in the composition of the non-incarcerated population, weighted by the average age-specific incarceration rate. The second term after the plus sign captures the difference in the incarceration rate schedule, that is when the two groups are likely to be incarcerated, weighted by the average population size of the non-incarcerated veterans and non-veterans. In the decomposition, we focus on men aged 20 to 34 because life course theory of delinquency largely focuses on this group for turning points. The decomposition captures the average cohort effect and the compositional and rate differences across periods for a fixed age group, that is men aged 20 to 34. And we perform these race-specific decompositions between veterans and non-veterans to uncover patterns of educational inequality in enlistment and incarceration for white and Black males. We employ this technique twice across each level of educational attainment, that is less than high school educated and high school graduates who have not completed any college coursework. Second, we also explore how demographic change in military employment across generations is associated with penal expansion using ordinary least squares regression analysis. We construct a panel data set using aggregated individual observations that include logged adjusted incarceration rates, which include inmates in the population denominator with population totals from household CPS data. For R race, white or Black, E education group, dropout or high school graduate, and V veteran status, veteran or non-veteran during year T associated with a vector of X variables as displayed in equation 3. We also include a vector of lagged military employment rates from 2 decades before, and that would be the gamma term, to estimate how the compositional shift to a smaller, more educated military affected incarceration rates across generations. So a 2-decade lag was selected to provide a few years for educational policy implementation and to measure the impact across a complete generation, that is 18 years. Fixed effects, lambda t, are included in the model to capture period-specific events, and standard errors have been clustered on year. And because equation 3 is a log level regression model to calculate the percentage change in the adjusted incarceration rate, the coefficients for beta and gamma must be retransformed. And so if the military provided protection against incarceration for young men with low levels of education, we expect that beta and gamma will be negative. So I want to begin by showing this figure, which illustrates the percentage of men age 18 through 64 who are veterans by race and education. So that in 1972, almost 43% of white male dropouts were veterans, but by 2012, that number had declined to 4.3%, or a 90% reduction. Among Black men who did not complete high school, 28.7% were veterans in 1972, but only 5.5% were in the population by the close of 2012, a reduction of 80.8%. For more educated men, the percentage of veterans in the population is higher and the decline occurs more slowly. And in this figure, we illustrate how veteran and non-veteran incarceration rates by race for men age 18 to 64 increased over time. So in the earliest year, 1972, these men were born between 1908 and 1954 and would have been at the highest risk of serving in World War II, the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Their counterparts in 2012 would have been born between 1948 and 1994 and were most likely to have served in Vietnam during the early years of the all-volunteer force or in recent US engagements in the Middle East. Incarceration rates for Black men have soared since 1972, and the gap in incarceration rates by veteran status has also increased. So that in 1972, Black non-veterans were incarcerated at a rate of a little over 1,000 per 100,000, but by 2012, that number had more than tripled to over 3,250 per 100,000. Similarly, the veteran incarceration rate among Black men quintupled over this period, increasing from 490 in 1972 to a little over 2,000 in 2012. So here we present, this table presents the result from our decomposition of the intersection between the shifting educational distribution and the changing rate of incarceration between veterans and non-veterans in the American population. Our figures of the changing concentration of veterans by race and education among the male working age population and the percentage of Black and white men who were incarcerated by veteran status are animated by research that documents how penal growth obscures the measurement of social inequality by excluding inmates from household-based surveys. This exclusion has led scholars to adjust measures of social inequality to include institutionalized populations. And because the data from the CPS are used to construct our rates, the trends we present for veteran status, educational attainment, and incarceration are adjusted for the exclusion of inmates from household surveys, allowing for more precise estimates of within group educational differences for veterans and between group incarceration rate differences among veterans and non-veterans. So our focus here is in identifying the unique contributions of each component in explaining racial and educational differences in incarceration. Because the goal of this decomposition is to explain the unique contribution of each factor to the observed change or difference, the effects should sum to 100%, and in most cases, both numbers are positive. Preston, Huveline, and Guillot argue that in many applications, however, one factor, either differences in the compositional effects or differences in rate schedules, will account for more than 100% of the original difference, particularly when two factors work in opposite directions, and there's no reason to believe such phenomena should operate in concert. And so this implicitly means that the other factor will be negative. And so we contend that such processes may be at work, as displayed in the previous figures, particularly for young African-American men with low levels of education who subsequently become disqualified from military enlistment, also going on to face difficulties in the civilian labor market and experience increased risk of criminal justice contact. So if this hypothesis is true, then among Black men only, we expect to find a positive effect of the veteran and compositional difference in excess of 100%, thereby rendering the incarceration rate schedule for Black men largely negative to offset the difference between these two components of change. So table 1 shows that for white high school dropouts, changes in the characteristics of veterans over time account for about 86% of the change in institutional composition. Incarceration rates for poorly educated whites explained about 14.1% of the difference. But for Black high school dropouts, the role of the military is more pronounced. The educational distribution of veterans accounts for 136% of the compositional change in institutions. Because the difference in the incarceration rate underexplains about 36% of the change, this finding suggests that many of the poorly educated Black men who have been incarcerated may have been at risk for enlistment in the military as a competing institution in criminal justice contact. These estimates, 14.1% for white dropouts and a negative 35.6% for Black dropouts, are closely aligned with research that estimates contemporary civilian incarceration rates for white and Black dropouts. Findings from our decomposition support our contention that the negative incarceration effect of table 1 for Black high school dropouts points to the differential enlistment patterns for severely disadvantaged men over time. Put simply, military enlistment may have been a protective factor for poorly educated Blacks against rising levels of incarceration, given that this group experienced significantly more positive compositional changes in enlistment relative to their white counterparts. Blacks who completed high school, however, were not significantly harmed by these compositional shifts, as indicated by numerical estimates in the last column of table 1. Because the new enlistment criteria did not exclude them, Black men who had graduated from high school remained able to use the armed forces as a protective institution against the criminal justice system. Finally, table 3 presents estimates from our log level regression model examining how veteran status and military enlistment are associated with incarceration for young Black and white men between 1972 and 2016. Not surprisingly, the baseline model, model 1, shows that Black men are over 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. I should note that these are prior to transforming the coefficients by exponentiation and subtraction of 1. Similarly, young men who have dropped out of high school are roughly 2.3 times more likely to be incarcerated than men without a high school diploma. Additionally, veteran status is not associated with incarceration in Model 2. However, upon fully interacting veteran status with race and education in Model 3, the main effect of veteran status is positively associated with incarceration. Model 3 also shows that Black veterans and veterans with low levels of education have incarceration rates 19.6 to 32.2% lower than their counterparts. And this association is so strong that the three-way interaction between race, education, and veteran status increased by 72.1% in logged units, going from a coefficient of a negative 0.215 in Model 3 to a negative 3.7 in Model 4 when military employment rates from a generation ago are controlled. The three-way interaction for Black veterans with less than a high school education shows that their incarceration rates were 30.9% lower than their counterparts because of the military enlistment policies that existed a generation ago, a generation before them, as the armed forces shifted to employing fewer men and women. The increased educational requirements for employment in the military are evident in Model 5, as a 1 percentage point increase in the employment of military service members with less than a high school education a generation ago is associated with a 21.4% reduction in incarceration. And figure 5 shows the predicted incarceration trends for Model 5 of Table 2 with shaded 95% confidence intervals. Of particular importance is that changes in enlistment selectivity over time did not produce statistically significant differences between veterans and non-veterans who were white high school dropouts or Black high school graduates. However, among white high school graduates, incarceration rates for veterans were higher than non-veterans for nearly 20 years between 1987 through 2006. Among Black men who dropped out of high school, differences in incarceration rates among veterans and non-veterans prior to the mid-1970s were not measurable. Yet, beginning around 1977, nearly 4 years after the transition to the all-volunteer force and almost a decade after 10 USC 504A, incarceration rates increased for Black veterans who had dropped out of high school. Increased for Black non-veterans who dropped out of high school. And this trend diverges significantly from the trend associated with Black veterans who dropped out of high school, confirming results from the decomposition of incarceration by race and education presented in Table 1. And so these findings speak to the role of contemporary institutional castling following a series of policy changes that within a decade would cleave off military enlistment as a potential turning point in the lives of young undereducated Black men. So in conclusion, the military enlistment was a major protective factor for young Black men and for men who dropped out of high school. And a 1 percentage point increase in the employment rate of military service members with less than a high school education a generation ago resulted in a 21% reduction in incarceration rates. Young Black veterans who dropped out of high school also have lower incarceration rates than similarly situated non-veteran Blacks. And by 2012, in estimates not shown from an index of dissimilarity, we find that nearly 1 in 11 incarcerated Black non-veterans who did not graduate from high school would need to enlist in the military in order to achieve a uniform population distribution with similarly situated non-incarcerated Black veterans. So the military as an independent bureaucratic institution has remarkable protective effects against the penal institution for men with low levels of education in general, and for African-American men in particular. Bourdieu powerfully wrote that the instituted institution makes us forget that it issues out a long series of acts of institutions, and hence has all the appearance of the natural. Secondary educational attainment and non-felony status for a military employment were not historically natural for service members of the armed forces, particularly during World Wars I and II. The expansion of the criminal justice apparatus under the Safe Streets Act, the simultaneous barring of felons for military enlistment under 10 USC 504A, and the subsequent requirements of a high school diploma or GED during military downsizing meant that young men with criminal records or those who did not graduate from high school were at an increased risk of civilian labor market exclusion during periods of deindustrialization and correctional custody during periods of criminal justice expansion. The castling of these two institutions in the lives of disadvantaged men requires hyperbolic doubt to reimagine how state power is exercised to shape and reshape the composition of the armed forces, the penal system, and the civilian labor market synchronistically. It should also go without saying, or I should also point out, that institutional castling can also be observed in other social problems that affect disadvantaged men and women in America, like health, residential location, and welfare support. And if there's time, we can discuss this in the Q&A. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian, so much. And I think now we'll open it up for questions. And while people are thinking about their questions, I will take the prerogative of the so-called moderator and ask, which came first, the paper or the chess in your life?
I think they are both coterminous to some degree. My father tried to teach me many times as a kid. It stuck with my brothers. And so they formally belong to chess clubs, but I picked up a few things here and there, but I'm not a chess master or avid player by any stretch of the imagination.
I just feel like it's such a clever idea, and I would love to know if you already have additional thoughts about, I think their last point or penultimate point about other domains we might see this, so like where people live or accessing welfare. So like, do you have initial thoughts about similar phenomenon elsewhere?
Yes, and actually that is, let me share the screen again. That is the focus of a book project that I plan on working on, that's on how social institutions penalize the existence of the American underclass. So a number of people, for instance, Loic Quant and God, I'm blanking on his name. He's at Columbia University. They've written about how, for instance, in the labor market, well, Loic has, about how in the labor market, Black women who were on welfare were forced back to work under the welfare reforms that Clinton passed in the mid to late 1990s. And how that resulted in welfare fraud investigations. And so in that sense, you begin to see like the protective factors of the safety net castle with the penal system in a way to prosecute women who are in need. And so that's one example. Another example has to deal with mental institutions and asylums, and how they castled with the penal system when a number of our political leaders decided to get rid of these institutions. And so what we see is that mental health and punishment begin to castle in the lives of people with health afflictions. Also, if we were to think about the disappearance of orphanages and their replacement, the foster care system, you also begin to see the castling of these systems for juvenile justice. I mean, I've been surprised to read up on this history, and it's really rather compelling to think about how we got juvenile courts. But that couldn't have happened without the disappearance of orphanages and the creation of the foster care system. And then, as we've seen here so far, military enlistment and mass incarceration. But then you also see this in immigration as well. And in the 2020 decennial census, where there was some debate about whether or not we should count, people who are undocumented and what that criminalization portends for those individuals. And then in another chapter, thinking about the second Bush presidential years, there was a robust debate about whether or not to create these retirement accounts to replace Social Security. And so this gets at a huge issue in economic demography around aging and retirement across generations. And in this chapter, what I lay out is that, again, we see the family as a protective unit, castle historically, because initially family units managed risk in old age by taking care of each other across these generations. But then Social Security emerged to help protect elderly from poverty, sort of freeing up the younger generation to join the labor market and to do all of these other activities. But when President Bush and a number of his policy advocates pushed or began pushing for these retirement accounts, and especially in the context of people's ability to make informed and wise investment decisions, it raises the question about whether or not the family unit as a way to protect the elderly, whether or not that would recastle again, and then family units are much more dependent on the younger generation. So I see institutional castling as a way to help us think about intergenerational inequalities over time. So I'll stop there again.
That's great. We have a question. This was a great presentation paper. Really excited by your insights into the last point on your slide, e.g. castling in different life domains or exchange markets. So the question is, would you say that these findings reflect a, quote, swing in the concentration of racial conflict from sectors?
A swing in, can you say that last part again?
Yes. Would you say that these findings reflect a swing in the concentration of racial conflict from sectors?
I mean, that's a great question. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure. And I think it would largely depend on the domain in which one were to examine institutional castling. So if we're talking about the family, I would say no. If we're talking about old age and retirement, I'd say no. But if we're talking about, the military, that's an open question. That's a legitimate question. If we're talking about mental health and the disappearance of mental health institutions and our, penchant to like incarcerate people with mental health problems, then that too is an open question. I just don't know. I think it all depends on the sphere in which racial conflict plays out.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was awesome to check out.
Perfect.
Thank you.
And I don't necessarily have to read these, so if you would like to just ask your questions, feel free. But in the interim, we'll ask, thanks so much for your presentation, and then ask, have you looked at alternative employment pathways for Black non-Hispanic graduates as military opportunities have disappeared? Wondering if anything has replaced the military other than the carceral system to any extent, or if you have any thoughts about what could based on your research.
Oh, that's another great question. We have not examined other or alternative paths to or other alternative paths for young Black men who had dropped out of high school. Again, those statistics that we showed at the beginning of the presentation, where their labor and activity, the people who just have given up and lost hope and they just permanently withdraw or have withdrawn from the labor force, that is, that's so discouraging and disheartening. And so, from their perspectives, there aren't really many alternatives. And we see this playing out even in our contemporary policy debate about whether or not to give, to change the federal minimum wage law to $15 an hour, right? There was a study that showed that, in no state in this country could a person afford rent on the minimum wage. And it's just like, there is no alternative path. There's just nothing, if you don't graduate from high school. And so, I think that it's time from a policy perspective for us to rethink, what the minimum wage is supposed to do, what enlistment in the military really confers. And so that's a really great question. I'm not sure if there's anything that, any other alternative that has replaced the military for people with low levels of education. Certainly not the labor market.
Okay, it looks like, are we ending at 1:30, Sarah? You could just, okay, great. So another question. I very much appreciate your quotes from W.E.B. Du Bois's insightful Black Reconstruction. As an activist in seeking more justice during this BLM time of reckoning, I ask for your advice in which institutions one should focus on now to bring about the most rapid improvements for Black and other people of color.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need people to focus on all institutions. I think, as Bourdieu pointed out, right, these institutions, we largely believe that they work independently, but their joint operations really matter for how we think about intergenerational inequality, even, inequality within this particular generation, but even across generations. And so what we really need are activists who are critiquing all institutions, all American institutions and their construction and functions. Because it could be that while we're only focused on one, we're missing the other. And also we're missing the sort of interconnectedness of these institutions.
And there's, I don't think there's another question pending, but I will just ask, of course, I have to, I'm a policy professor. You mentioned it, it's like your last chapter. What do you see in terms of policy if not solutions, then innovations or directions that we could go in that would address some of the issues you raised.
Karen, you just had to ask that
I
question.
know, you know I had to. You know, it's like,
I'm no policy wonk. I'm not trained to think about policy, but I think that it's an important question, right? That, you know, I think our policymakers, I was watching something last night and it was so disheartening, you know, watching some US senators and, you know, US representatives talk about like, or reminisce on how they were able to do all the things that they could do on $2 an hour,
oh, yeah.
like 80 years ago. And it's just like, give me a break. This is not, times have totally changed.
Right.
And so I think that, like, you know, as a policy prescription, it would be helpful to think about in this landscape when everyone's vying for the attention of policymakers for a number of different causes, that we were to step back and think about generations and think about cohorts, and what their needs are specifically, so that, you know, if we were to take a generational or cohort perspective on not like what they did 100 years ago, but, you know, what our contemporary generations and cohorts are experiencing, I think we would have an opportunity to solve a lot of pressing social problems instead of like reminiscing on the good days when you could like get by on $2 an hour, but then your tuition was only $900 a year. You know, it's just like, give me a break. So, you know, I see like as a policy solution, and I don't know if anyone's written on this, and you certainly know better than I would, Karen, you know, written about the policy frame, you know, and like how we frame, you know, social problems in and of themselves is what needs to change among our policy makers.
Absolutely. We call that defining the problem in the world of policy. And I hope some of our policy students that I know are here are going to join the next session and they can give you more thoughts on that. But it looks like we're out of time just about, unless there's anything else, any burning questions or comments that anybody needs to make. I will stop talking and let that happen.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was such a lovely, intriguing presentation, Dr. Sykes, and thank you, Dr. Martin. It was lovely having you, and you did an excellent job moderating. So it's great to hear from you, and we do invite more conversation for the students at the next session. So I will leave it at that. So thank you again. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for the invitation, for being here.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, we'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Bryan. Thank you, Karen.
Yeah.
So it was fantastic.
Thank you.
The link is in the Zoom, in the chat, and lots of praise in the chat too.
We'll see you guys.